Since the very start of the civil war in Syria, the British Foreign Office has been one of the key international players behind the foreign-backed militancy which has gripped that country for years. Millions of people have been forced to leave as a result of the insurgency against the government of President Bashar al-Assad. Despite this, until recently the British authorities had effectively said no to the UNHCR's call to let in some of the most vulnerable refugees. Was this fair? Can the UK morally justify helping to wage war at the same time as having closed the door on its refugees for years? Does this reflect a history of starting conflicts and leaving trouble behind afterwards? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. Hundreds of online videos showing Syrian insurgents torturing people has served to alter global opinion. So we began by asking the public, have your views changed about UK support for Syrian militants? And if so, how? There have been hundreds of online Syrian videos showing the insurgents torturing people, and that's changed some world opinion. Have your views about UK support for Syrian militants changed at all? And if so, how? And if not, why not?
Well, how do you define militants? I mean, they're all militant, aren't they?
Unfortunately, no, they haven't changed. I don't see that the views were very different before those images were produced. So personally, no change at all.
I think originally the sort of insurgents perhaps it was perhaps a more accurate representation of what the general population of Syria thought, but I think increasingly it's more sort of extremist rather than the people representing themselves. So I think now it would sort of be unwise for any sort of UK involvement. Hundreds of online videos of Syrian insurgents torturing people have changed some world opinion. Have your views about UK support for Syrian militants changed at all, and if so, how?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's a heartbreaking situation, but the problem is that it's very difficult to get to the bottom of exactly who's doing what to who.
They haven't changed in the recent past, no.
I don't think they've really changed at all, no. I think it's a sufficiently messy situation that we shouldn't take one side or the other, really.
So those are the opinions of the general public. We asked our experts for their view about the impact on global opinion of the online videos of torture by the Syrian insurgents.
I think that if you look, lots of people are now considering very, very different situation in Syria. As far as I'm concerned, the whole question of the rising against Assad very, very quickly turned into a civil war, and now we have an absolutely desperate situation where there's fighting on both sides, where people are being killed and tortured on both sides, and that's something which means that I very, very much oppose any attempt at backing the opposition or in any way at giving the British government giving them any support or aid.
Actually, my views about the British policy has not changed in the past 3 years about the Syrian uprising, because from the beginning I could see that the British government was part of the NATO plans to change the uprising from a mass peaceful uprising to become a military one, which involved terrorist groups such as al-Nusra, such as the Islamic State, etc. The British government and the Israelis and the US governments and administration were very much aware from the beginning that the way they are supporting the armed uprising will only leads to destruction of the Syrian state. It will not lead to actually to the fall of the government of Bashar al-Assad. Maybe they thought at the beginning that this would happen within few weeks, but they should have known from within months that was not the way it's going, and that the way it's going was the destruction of the state itself, the mass killing of innocent civilians.
So clearly our experts take a rather negative view of British policy in this regard. But given that Britain is indeed a major backer of the uprising, the question we wanted to ask the public was to what extent they felt that Britain holds responsibility for the increasing bloodshed in Syria. The UK government is in fact quite a major backer of the militants. How much responsibility do you feel Britain ought to take for what's turning into a Syrian bloodbath?
None.
And why is that?
Because it's not our problem. Okay. I think when we started out, we weren't to know that the militants were going to turn out to be quite as militant as they were. So you thought that in the beginning they were fighting for democracy and freedom, and now it looks as though they're actually fighting for something completely different.
I think if we're getting involved, we need to take responsibility. I mean, I think it's as simple as that, really. We can't just sort of dabble. So.
I mean, that's kind of, I wouldn't even really feel qualified to answer that question. I think with a lot of these conflicts, it's, you know, we're aware of what's happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, to a certain extent in Libya. How helpful is it to intercede? I think that's, yeah, I already feel adrift answering that question. Like, I don't have a clear answer on it myself. Like, what's the best thing to do? Is it to take some kind of military strike against Assad and go in that heavy-handed way, or is that just going to make matters worse? So yeah, my answer would be I don't know.
The UK government is a major backer of the militants. How much responsibility do you feel Britain should hold for what's turning into something of a Syrian bloodbath?
For me, because it's their own country, I feel that we shouldn't take too much responsibility for that, but any assistance, if possible, should be given.
I think it's difficult for Britain as an external country to get involved in other countries' internal affairs. I mean, we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan that often that's not the best solution. Really, we should be working with the groups within the country to try and come up with, you know, a proper solution for their own future.
Again, interesting views from the public. Our experts had very strong opinions about our first question. How do they feel about this question of responsibility?
I think the problem is that Britain has a very bad role that it's played, firstly in terms of the invasion of Iraq, which is still having consequences in the Middle East, and they have tried repeatedly to intervene in Syria, firstly covertly by backing different groups, by sending arms, by sending money, by doing all these kind of things, and last August they tried to do so overtly as well. I think we have to reject any British involvement in it at all. It is not Britain's business. And of course what we find is when it comes to them actually doing something useful, like providing homes and refuge for the many refugees that now are in Syria, we find the British government does virtually nothing.
I believe that the British government is fully responsible on the bloodshed in Syria. And the reason is because from within very few weeks, they started, especially the British Special Forces, the British Intelligence Service, involved in the training camps, especially in Turkey. We are talking about 3 training camps in Turkey, one near Istanbul, one in Iskenderuna, the other one near the borders, which involved, without any doubt anymore, because it's been reported in many newspapers, Western newspapers, that there are involvement of British Intelligence Service. So we are talking here about 2 involvement. First, it was the direct involvement in training, arming, and financing. Maybe financing was also not direct but indirect through Saudi Arabia and Qatar, etc. But definitely the British involvement was full from, well, I call it month 3.
Many analysts have criticised the United Kingdom for funding what have turned out to be unidentified militant groups in Syria. How do the public, who pay the bill, feel about this question? Quite a few analysts criticise the United Kingdom government for supporting and funding effectively some unidentified terrorists in Syria. How risky do you feel Britain's policy is?
Again, I just don't know the facts properly. Who does know the facts? I wonder. You read one thing and the next day you read something else. So my feeling is that at the moment there seems to be some evidence that the insurgents are being backed by Al-Qaeda. Is that right? Have I said it right? I mean, And that would be disastrous. But who knows whether it's true or not? You hear one day it's true, and you hear the next day that it's not quite the same. So I think one has to be very hesitant about backing people with military intervention.
It's such a complex issue, and I think increasingly what started off as freedom fighters, I think it's largely been hijacked, and I think the people that are sort of involved in it now, they're sort of more extremist policies, more extremist views, and we don't know where our money's really going to end up. And by funding these people, we could be putting people into power or helping them get into power when they could be no better than what preceded them.
I think it's very risky, yeah. So I don't think we really know which side are committing the atrocities. I think it's a very messy, complex situation. I don't think we should really be intervening in that way. I think we should be trying to send humanitarian aid and obviously lobby for the aggression to stop. But I don't think that we should be funding armed groups on either side.
The best answer I can give to that question is it probably has a tendency to be too risky because certainly in the past Western governments have been too hawkish on liberal values where perhaps they don't apply. So there's probably a tendency there.
We turn to our experts who have analysed the composition of the militancy in Syria in great detail. How risky is Britain's policy?
Britain's policy has been that it wanted to overthrow Assad, and it thought it could use the opposition in order to do so as part of its wider political intervention in the Middle East. It therefore has backed all sorts of people, it has tried to intervene repeatedly, and I think has made the war much worse, has made the situation much worse, and continues to try to put pressure on various players inside the Middle East to try and get its own way. And I think it really is incumbent on Britain to say that it doesn't have any role to play in Syria and it should stay out. And that's certainly the view of the majority of British people who quite clearly opposed any intervention back in August when David Cameron tried to take us into war there.
I believe here this is a very important question. How risky to whom? If we are talking as British, then I believe it was very risky to the future of terrorism acts in this country because they should have known, and I'm sure they knew, that if the terrorist organizations such as al-Nusra, such as Islamic States, which actually they counted them later on as terrorist organization and part of Al-Qaeda, but they knew from day one that they are really supporting this organization. They knew from day one that there are tens, then hundreds of British subjects which are going to fight in Syria. We are talking about at least between 200 to 500 British subjects who are going to fight in Syria with a full knowledge of the British government. I do not, and I cannot believe there is anybody who knows what's going on, believe that Turkey is part of NATO, and all the British subjects gone, more or less 95% maybe gone through the Turkish territory. So that means if the British government wanted to stop anybody, they could have done that without any problems, because Turkey and the UK government are cooperating on security aspects. And really, it seems without any doubt now that the British government were very much behind, I will not say closing eyes, but really behind more British Muslims to go and fight against the Syrian government.
Prime Minister David Cameron has claimed humanitarian reasons for backing the militancy in Syria. However, and despite recently backtracking on the question of refugees, until now he has turned thousands of Syrians away from the shores of Britain. So in this context, to what extent do the public trust the claimed motivations behind this foreign policy? Prime Minister Cameron has claimed humanitarian reasons for supporting the militants, as you've said. But he did turn away thousands of Syrian refugees. Do you trust the motivations driving this foreign policy?
No, I don't. I mean, I think historically British foreign policy has always been sort of labyrinthine in its thinking, often riddled with inconsistencies because it is so unnecessarily complex in very many ways. You know, I think that we do often get ourselves into messes with overly complicated foreign policy that, again, as I said before, hasn't really been properly thought through. It's been thought through in one sense, in one aspect, but not whether that aspect sits with something else. You know, a bit like in the old days when we heavily armed Saddam Hussein because we didn't like his neighbour Iran and he was against them, and then that just came back to bite us later. So I think this could be another example of that sort of situation, short-term thinking that suits a particular policy or some aspect of it.
I trust the motivations behind the policy. However, I would personally think that the Cameron government is too limited in its support, and I think very strongly that the Cameron government should rethink its policy of providing a safe haven for refugees from the Syrian crisis.
I don't trust him and his motivations, I'm afraid. I mean, I think it does sound like double standards there.
I think our foreign policy often is questionable. I'd like to see a lot more support for humanitarian help, particularly victims of torture or orphans. You know, vulnerable people being given really positive support by this country, perhaps being given asylum, certainly being given much better humanitarian support. I think, to my thinking, that would be more important than political support and military support to try and help those who are actually suffering because of the conflict. You know, huge numbers of refugees living in appalling conditions. It's clearly not acceptable, and I think Britain should be doing more to help them.
Again, a useful insight into public opinion. But how credible is the Prime Minister's claim that humanitarian reasons lie behind Britain's backing of the insurgents in Syria? Here's what our expert said.
I think David Cameron is a complete hypocrite over foreign policy, because we're always told when they want to go to war that it's to help people, it's about humanitarian disaster. The Syrian situation is now one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world. There are literally millions of people who've been displaced, who need help and who want refuge, who are now in camps where they're hungry, where they're cold, where they're not getting proper treatment. A rich country like Britain would be much better placed spending money on saying that these Syrians can come to Britain as refugees rather than spending it on the military. And yet when it comes to helping them, there's only token help. 500 people are going to be allowed into Britain on a temporary basis. Now, that isn't serious in terms of what one of the richest countries in the world should be able to do, but it's absolutely par for the course. It's what Tony Blair was like over Iraq, and it's absolutely typical of the British government. They want to go to war. They don't want to help people who need peace.
Oh, there is no question about this. We are talking about the British establishment, foreign policy always motivated by the establishment. I don't have to talk about Iraq. I think this is quite clear about it. We all know what happens on the chemical claim of the chemical weapons in Iraq. We all know what the British government at the time has done, what lies have told the British people. Now we are talking about Syria, humanitarian. Oh, this is a bit surprising that the British government decided that it will support a humanitarian case in Syria, where they are in full knowledge within the past 3 years that what's going on, Israeli has moved to act of terrorism by most of the militant opposition. And I am here just in case not talking about the internal political opposition, which I have a lot of respect for the internal political opposition in Syria, but the British government was not, and I repeat, not interested in listening to these people, to the real opposition of the Syrian government. They were only interested in their foreign policy, in supporting the US policy, in supporting the Israeli policy, and the destruction of the Syrian state and on the bloodshed in Syria.
This brings us to our last simple but central question. Critics say that Britain starts wars but leaves a mess. What's the view of the public? Some critics say that Britain starts wars and leaves a mess. What's your view?
Well, we have, haven't we? Well, I mean, that's my view, we have. In Iraq, we left a war, we left a complete mess because, you know, the delightful Mr. Blair did not sort out what might happen later, and it seems almost as if the same thing is happening in Afghanistan. Though, if one is to believe what one reads in the press, it feels a little bit better in Afghanistan. At least one feels that one has done something positive, although we've trained the army so-called in Iraq too. But in a country where there is, the two countries where there is so much corruption, both are the same, there is so much corruption, you know, who's to know how helpful we are being? We might be actually helping the enemy.
Completely, yeah. We've made a mess of countries for hundreds of years. So why stop now? I guess. Yeah.
That is one way of looking at it. Yes.
Is that how you look at it?
It certainly has a kernel of truth in it.
Critics say that Britain starts wars and leaves a mess. What's your view?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
What about in the case of Syria?
In the case of Syria, I should think it's a hell of a mess, and yes, that's probably the truth.
Well, if you take a long view, I think that's certainly the case.
What about in this case?
In this case, I don't know.
What does history tell us about Britain's record of starting conflicts and leaving trouble behind? Back to our experts.
Britain has a very bad record of starting wars, saying that they're going to be rapid, they'll help people, they'll create democracy, and leaving a tremendous mess at the end of it. We've seen this in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Iraq, where the situation is now getting worse, and we've seen it in Libya, where the country is broken up into all sorts of different fighting factions. In that situation, you would think that the British government would understand that its role is a totally negative one in this respect, and it should withdraw from all foreign wars of aggression which it's been so involved in. Unfortunately, its attitude is exactly the opposite, and it was only thanks to the vote in Parliament and to British public opinion and to the anti-war movement that they were stopped from another war, a direct intervention in Syria.
British start wars, I'm not sure if they started this one, but they were part of the war against in what happened in Syria. Leaving a mess, that's part of the constructive chaos of the British government, which is part of the neocon going back to 12 years ago in Iraq, then Afghanistan, now it's in Syria. Leaving a mess is part of this constructive chaos policy. So I do believe this is always the case with this.
For centuries, Britain has claimed to be a global ambassador for fighting unfairness and helping people in other countries in their struggles against injustice. However, to many it seems that Britain's claim to be doing what's right conceals a violent and risky foreign policy which stands to harm many of the most vulnerable. Worse still, when asked to welcome people fleeing Syria and its civil war, in part sponsored by Britain itself, until recently Britain's leaders have been unhappy to let them in. This would suggest that while Britain is willing to help sponsor the fighting, it seems very unwilling to help clean up the mess.